Welcome to lecture 2. We are going to be doing some pretty interesting stuff. We are going to be looking at frequency distribution and the different graphs. So we will look at how to construct the tables of frequency distribution. We will look at limits, midpoints, relative frequencies, cumulative frequencies, and boundaries. And once we have the table, we will move on to plot the graphs. So we will construct a frequency histogram, frequency polygram, relative frequency histogram, and ogives. All these graphs will be coming from the tables we have constructed here. It's pretty straightforward. So here, for example, you have a frequency distribution, you have the different classes, and you have the different frequencies. Now, a frequency simply represents the number of occurrence per class. So if you go out and collect data, you are trying to look at the number of data points that falls within the different classes. So that's what we are going to be doing. Now, here you have the lower class, you have the upper class there, and generally the class width is just the difference between these two classes. So generally, if you do 6 minus 1, you'll get 5, and that's it. Now, let's take this example that will help us put it together. I could spend time explaining the theory, as you'll see on the class notes that you have a lot of explanations of the different steps, but I would rather just move on directly to the example so that you see how to do it. So here it says the following sample data set list the prices of 30 portable GPS. So you have 30 GPS. These are the prices. You collect the prices and you've been told you have to construct a frequency distribution in 7 classes. Now remember, the number of classes have been given. You've been asked to put it in 7 classes. So what do we do? The first thing we need to do, given that we've been told we need 7 classes, the first step is you need the number of classes. This has been given. The second is to compute the class width. Now, how do you complete the class width when you have your data? You simply take a look at the data and look for the maximum amount and you look for the minimum. So if you take a look here, a rapid look here, you'll find that the maximum is 450, the minimum is 59. So your class width is the max minus min divided by the number of classes. It's already been given here. So if you do that, you end up having that, and it's important to round up. In some cases, some people round down, but in the examples we'll be taking and also the things I'll ask you to do, I will generally tell you if you should round up or you should round down. Okay, so the next step, once you have your class width, is to get things organized in your table. So generally, draw your table and start with a minimum value. You have your minimum value, so you should immediately construct your lower limit before anything. So from your minimum, add the class width. We initially found that the class width is 56. So from 59, add 56, add 56, add 56, and so on, and you will be able to fill everything. Once you have done that, you simply subtract 1 to fill the upper limit. The upper limit in general, you simply take away 1 from the second position of your lower limit and you put it there. So here, for example, you'll find that in order to get this, we just took away 1 from 51. And you can keep taking away 1. And you'll find that this is 227, this is 226, 283, 282. Or you start here and you just add 56 everywhere until you get to this point. Now, if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you now have your 7 classes, and it's very straightforward. So you can rewind the video, watch it, and make sure this is very clear. Because if you miss this part, everything else will be a mess. Let's proceed. Now, once you've built that, you now need to get into your data set and count the different occurrences for each class. So here is your class, here is your data set. So just come here and you look for the first class. How many occurrences do you have for the first, second, third, fourth, and so on, until you have the tallies for all the classes. So when you find 1 point, you put 1. Another point, you just put the tallies. So here, for example, we have 5 points, we put 5. We have 8, we put 8, and so on. So the tally is just to help you remember how many points you have. So the frequency has to do with the number of times, the number of occurrences per class. Once you've gotten your frequency, you can just add it up to make sure it sums to 30. If that's not the case, it means you've missed something. Now, some in general, when a point is chosen, they just mark it off. Okay, let's move on. Now that you have your frequency, it's important to compute your midpoint. How do you compute the midpoint? For each class, it's the midpoint of a class. You simply sum the lower and the upper limit and you divide by 2, and that will give you the midpoint. Straightforward. 59 plus 114 divided by 2, it gives you your midpoint. So let's move on to the next computation. After that, you need to compute what is known as the relative frequency. So you have the different frequencies per class, and you want to look at the relative frequency, which simply means you want to look at this in relative to the total. So here, for example, you have 5, and n is the sample size, and we know we are dealing with 30 GPS. So you will be dividing 5 by 30, 8 by 30. Everywhere you divide the frequencies by the sample size, and that is given. So you have 5 by 30 and so on, and you leave it. The default is just have 2 decimal places. It looks nice. Now let's move on. Now we want to compute the cumulative frequency. You have your frequency. In order to have the cumulative frequency, you always start with the frequency of the first class, and then you add the second class to the value of the first class, and that will give you the value here, and you keep adding. So here, for example, you'll do 5 plus 8, and it's going to give you the value you have here, 13. Now you do 13 plus 6, it's going to give you 19, and you keep doing that, and at the end, it has to give you 30. It has to sum up to your sample size. Now you can see you have 30 here. You have your relative frequency. If you add the relative frequency, it has to sum up to 1. If you add your frequency, it has to sum up to 30. Now, let's move on. We are close to the end of computing a table. So you should be comfortable computing this table starting from raw numbers as we saw at the beginning. So let's move on. The next thing we want to do is to start putting out our graphs. Now, the first one is the frequency histogram. Now, what is the frequency histogram? It's simply a graphical representation of the distribution. In other words, what is the shape of your data? Where do you have most of the values? Where do you have the least values? The smallest or the highest values? You want to take a look at it. Okay, enough of this blah, blah, blah. How do we compute a frequency distribution? It's important for you to compute the class boundaries. You have the classes, but you now have to compute the class boundaries. That's very straightforward. All you need to do when you come here, this is your class. You want your class boundaries. In order to compute that, you just do the math. This boundary minus that, if it gives you 1, you take half the distance. In case it did not give you 1, whatever it gives you, you take half of it. And then you subtract it from the lower boundary, and then you add it to the higher boundary of one class. So let's just do it here. Here, for example, you have 58.5 because Here we have half the distance is 0.5. Now take it as a rule of thumb, it's generally going to be 0.5. So you subtract 0.5 from this and you add 0.5. That's why we have 58.5 and here we have 114.5. Now you can immediately know that in this case we will have 114.5 and here we'll have 170.5 and so on and so forth. So here, this is how it looks like. Now, once you have that, given that you had initially computed the midpoint of the class, whereby you added this and divided by 2, you divided by 2. Now you have the class boundaries, you have the frequencies, you can go on and plot your graph. Now, there are two approaches. You can plot it just using the class boundaries, or you can plot it using the midpoint. Anyone does the job. So let's start with the first one whereby we use the midpoint. Now, what do we mean by broken axis? We are simply saying that we don't want to start at 0. Because if you start at 0, it doesn't look nice. It means maybe things start here and you have all of the space empty until you get to here. No, we just use broken axis to say we are aware that there are numbers here, but we want to start here to economize space. So you will start here. Here is your midpoint. You have the different midpoints and you simply place the frequencies that goes with the different midpoints. So you now have your frequency histogram using the midpoints. The next one, we want to do it using the class boundaries. Here are the class boundaries and you have the frequencies going with each class boundary. What can you say from this analysis? You can see that more than half of the GPS navigators are priced below 226.5. Okay, more than half are priced below 226.5. You can see that, and you can also see that a small amount, just 3, price above 450. Why is that? That's an important question. And what does it imply? It's also an important question. Maybe not for you today, but for another. That just gives you an idea how to approach these things. Now, the next graph we want to plot is the polygon. Now, the polygon is students generally mess this up because they don't know where to start. You see, this is your starting point, this is your ending. Do not let it suspend. So students generally use midpoints, they connect the midpoints, but they let it suspending and then they lose marks. Do not do that. How do you go about doing that? You see, you have the midpoints. You need it for your polygon. However, you need it to go all the way down. And if you take a look here, you will see that it's going to tell you that the left side should be extended to one class. Now, at the beginning, when we had done the maximum data point minus minimum divided by the number of classes, we did see that our class size was 56. So how do you know where you extend your thing here and how do you know what number you put here? You simply come here and you subtract the class size from this. We know our class size is 56. When you do 86.5 minus 56, you end up with that value. And if you come here, you do 422.5 plus 56, you surely end up with that value. So that is what enables you to place it there. This is the midpoint of the first class, but you want to extend it. Make sure it's extended, never leave it suspending. That will not be cool. Now let's take a look at the relative frequency histogram. The relative frequency histogram makes use of your relative frequency. Your relative frequency, you simply divide your frequency by your sample size. You had already computed that. It should be part of your table. So when you are doing your histogram, you no more use the frequency. You now use the frequency, the relative frequency for your histogram. So it's exactly the same. You can do it using the midpoints or you can do it using the class boundaries. However, now you are using the relative frequency on your y-axis and not the frequency. and it's important for you to familiarize yourself with the type of conclusions you can draw from it. Now, we are looking at the last one, which is the cumulative frequency graph, also known as the OGIF. Basically, for you to do that, you need to use the cumulative frequency table we had initially computed. So you are going to start from 5 and go all the way to 30. So how does that go? You start from 58. This is your low for your first class. You start from the lower class boundary. We know that for the first class we have 5. So you will connect the 2 points, and this upper point is 5. Now, if you connect the next one, you will see that for the upper point of the second class, you are going to be using the value you had here. You have 13 for that value, and you keep going until you end up with 30. That is it for this lecture. Have fun.